welcome to this week's episode of Automated. I, of course, am Stefan Oxmacher, your hostess with the mostest, CEO and co-founder here at Polymath Robotics. Sitting across from me is a man who usually is wearing the same shirt as I'm wearing. However, approximately 17 milliliters of bird poop fell in front of my shirt earlier today, and this gentleman is now representing House Atreides, which is concerning to me because I always thought he was a Harkonnen fan. Sir, who are you, and what is this shirt that you're wearing?
Fear is the mind killer.
This, of course, is Automated, our weekly podcast where we talk about robots. We spitball a robot into existence, and we talk about some sort of topic in robotics. Ilia, what's our topic today?
We are going to talk about dirty deeds done robot cheap.
AKA the dirt on dirt. And how easy of a problem picking up dirt and doing things with dirt or piles of material is, and why it's not just, some easy little problem.
Yep.
But before that, we're going to play our game. So this is our game that we play every single week where we each draw a card for a technology and a business case that we have to solve. But similar to my 84-year-old aunt, who thinks that everything she sees on Facebook is a direct message directed to her, and that any old picture that's popped up on her timeline, someone directly shared with her that she needs to comment on. I saw a tweet on LinkedIn in the last week that I assume was made just for us. So Nat Friedman, who had been CEO, I believe, of GitHub or GitLab, or president or some he had a GitHub account, I'm pretty sure. I'm like 60% confident he had a GitHub account. He made a post on Twitter that he doesn't want a leaf blower, because it's, it's kind of a vibe killer when you live in probably a nice neighborhood. He wanted a robot that went around his yard to pick up leaves and quietly put them into a bag, ideally during the evening. And that was the robot that he wanted. And now apparently a friend of our Knowledge AI system, a best friend, in fact, responded to this and got an AI grant to work on it over the summer. But I think that Nat Friedman really wanted us to solve it during this podcast. This is what I learned from my aunt. The internet is about me entirely. So
can confirm this is what Stefan thinks.
So I think here's the use case. I have a house. I have leaves in front of it. I'm imagining my parents' house where they had like an oak tree or two.
So you have a house and a yard.
Yep.
It's clearly not in San Francisco.
I have a backyard in San Francisco, but I have a house. I have a house in the yard. Leaves fall down, sometimes during the year, and a robot that goes around and quietly picks them up and operates at night, so it's unobtrusive.
So that's a business case.
Yeah.
What tech should we use? You want to pick one?
I think let's try to be a little so he gave a $15,000 grant to somebody.
Okay.
So let's try to do it within $15,000.
$15K. So arms are out immediately.
Yeah, no arms.
Yeah, because too expensive.
Yeah, I mean, there might be some hobbyist arms that are cheaper than that if locomotion was free.
Okay, but does he want it to work once, or does he want it to work the entire season?
I don't know where Nat lives, so I'm thinking we just get his address somehow, and we show up in the middle of the night at his house and launch this robot there. So it ideally it will work that evening, but it doesn't have to work every day forever.
So you're thinking of running it overnight?
Yes. I think it's operating between, let's say, midnight and 4:30 a.m. A lot of these rich tech people wake up at 5.
So you know what your favorite thing would be if you're using any kind of vision to detect these leaves is bright floodlights running around your bedroom window in the middle of the night.
Well, maybe he has a sleep mask. People do that.
Are you sure you just don't want to run during the day when it's
No, because that makes my house not seem as luxurious.
Because it's not just magic overnight.
Yes, I want
fairies.
I want the first leaves to come off the trees on Saturday afternoon, and the next morning, my neighbor's house is covered in leaves, and they look slovenly and like a loser. But my house has not a leaf.
Okay, and you want to do this silently.
Yeah, or effectively silently.
Yeah, close to silently.
You can't hear it from more than, let's say, 50 feet away, or through a reasonable brick wall.
I think the trick here is not to let the leaves touch the ground. So what you want is
cut down the tree.
No, I mean there's that, but no. You get a pan tilt access turret and a high power laser.
Okay.
And as the leaf falls, it vaporizes it in midair. And if it happens to miss, it will blind your neighbor down the street. But that's a cost you're willing to pay.
I don't care about my neighbors.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't have to worry about keeping up with the Joneses if they can't see.
Exactly. It would be much easier to keep up with at that point.
Well, I don't know the latest on chemical lasers. If I shot a chemical laser through at a leaf, would it burn something on the other side of the leaf? Because I assume the laser beam is not 4 inches wide and vaporizes the entire leaf in one go, or is the hope that I hit it and I set it on fire and it burns itself into ashes by the time it falls on the ground.
Yeah, because as it's falling, there's a lot of oxygen supply, so it'll just flame up and there you go.
I mean, that actually, it would be cool to have a house where the front yard there was just like falling fire and somehow it never got out of hand. That would be a really cool California flex.
Yeah, particularly relevant for California with wildfires.
Like, you'd be very popular until you were killed.
It's okay. Nobody could get close enough to you because they'd all be blinded.
No. I think the leaves have to hit the ground. I think auto turret shooting lasers at leaves like spoils some of the fun. Like, I was thinking, we have a jackal in the office. We have an autonomy core. We could pay someone to do like a segmentation model to recognize leaves, and we could do some little the nail thing in BattleBots.
I think you're overcomplicating
to go pick them down.
You're overcomplicated. Just coverage map the entire place. You're doing it at night. You can be slow. Coverage map the entire thing and just have a little low power vacuum cleaner. The leaf will get sucked up. If there's no leaf, that's fine. The grass gets pulled slightly, but nothing happens to it. And it just vacuums back and forth across the entire yard. It doesn't have to be loud. It could be low power enough to just pick up a leaf at a time or a few leaves at a time.
But what if the leaves, like sometimes leaves are wet and they get like kind of mucky and connected to each other, and then they'd be probably too heavy.
Well, you don't let it get to that state, right?
But what if it's raining when the leaves come down? I assume, like, I'm not a leaf fallologist, which is an important discipline.
Yeah.
But I assume that like a lot of leaves fall out of trees during rainstorms. And I think the SLA is like there's never more than like 3 or 4 leaves in my front yard.
Well, then, like,
I can't wait for it to stop raining and then go get the leaves.
Then your idea of a leaf fairy that does its work overnight, like that's a counter requirement here, right? Because if during the day a few leaves fall on the ground, like you got to pick one or the other. Which one is more important, timeliness or magic? Leaf fairy overnight.
Yeah, I think it's just overnight. Yeah, so the leaves can accumulate during the day.
Right.
But I can't wait 4 nights for the leaves to dry out so my little low power vacuum cleaner can pick them up.
All right. I think the other option then is flamethrower.
I know that you wanted to do this option from the get-go. But so again, let's assume it hasn't rained recently. Though, like, probably if I have a nice like Atherton house, I probably have sprinkler system in it to keep my grass nice and green. But like, is there a way that you can manage a flamethrower to burn the leaves but not the grass?
Maybe you just have a ton of tiny little jets and you pick which jets are on or off. It's more like a flame printer at that point rather than a flamethrower.
It'd be like a Blue River thing or like any of these like laser weeders.
Yeah, exactly.
Just for getting rid of leaves in people's front yards.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. If you want silence.
But I think the system then would become like disproportionately expensive.
Well, that's why you go the brute force method. A cheap flamethrower, the grass gets a little singed, it'll grow back. It's fine. No, there's no leaves.
Well, why not just have a mobile robot with like a needle that then stabs the middle of each leaf target, and then once the needle's like kind of full, it drives to the gutter and just like empties it onto the gutter. Like growing up, we would like sweep the leaves into the gutters or whatever, and then the leaf truck would come and take them away.
I think sweeping is more feasible. I think the stabbing thing, like if you actually work with leaves, you're just going to break them into smaller leaf pieces. Like they're not, dragging.
Well, actually, I don't know how true that is when they first fall. Like if they've been on the ground for like months, sure, but when they first fall, they weren't dead like more than a week before. Their structural integrities. But I guess like having lived in San Francisco now for 10 years, I have minimally interacted with like
vegetation
or like leaves on the ground. Like, whereas it was a major part of my life growing up in the Northeast.
Yeah, I think maybe a rake would probably be your best bet. Just drag a rake around and just do a coverage planner in a way that
with a rake.
You just probabilistically catch most of the leaves.
And then when you get like poor progress or something because you have too many leaves in the rake, then you go to the gutter.
I think for $15K, you can make a robot that's more powerful than any amount of leaves you could possibly stick in a rake.
No, we had a lot of leaves in my front. Like we had,
but it's slow. It doesn't have to do it fast, right? It doesn't have to do it quickly. You just gear down the motor to insane levels. So it's going to pull like 200 pounds of force. Like,
I mean, my house growing up was not that big. I think our front yard was maybe 1,500 square feet. And there'd be like piles of leaves in our gutter that were like 3 feet tall by like 8 feet wide and like maybe 2 or 3 feet. Like
we'll monitor progress. And if it gets stuck, it'll back up a little bit and retry that spot.
So basically, if it is just a rake, we could just buy a rake, bolt it on, ideally like bolting it on, onto the jackal.
I feel there is probably something to be said about the rake motion where you put it down, pull, and then pick up and go again.
Yep.
So you probably want one actuation degree on the rake just to lift it up and down. But other than that, that's probably the cheapest way to do it, right? Maybe not a jackal because jackals are not particularly cheap.
Yeah, but we have
the
one.
Equivalent.
And I want to show up at this guy's house with a robot
with a
that
rake
just
on it.
Works in his house, in his front yard, but without his consent. And like maybe the way that we tell him that like we raked his leaves is we respond to his tweet with a bunch of pictures of his house at night and then some leaves.
Yeah. And if anybody gets close to it, it just turns on the laser again and blinds you and runs away. Optional flamethrower attachment.
An optional laser turret.
Yep.
What are we calling this? Steal $15,000 from college students, 3,000?
I don't know. The rakish leaf fairy.
The rakish robot.
The rakish robot. Yeah.
3,000. While we're thinking about that, when we're going and vacuuming things up, we probably would have had to torque the vacuum or the filters on it or whatever to not suck up too much of the topsoil.
Yep.
Now let's say we sucked up a lot of the topsoil, or let's say we took up a big chunk of it accidentally and wanted to redistribute it back. How straightforward is doing weird things with dirt?
Not very straightforward.
So like lore that I have heard is that the early John Deere and Caterpillar programs, and we're obviously transitioning from our game to our topic of the dirt on dirt.
Dirty jobs done robot cheap.
Done robot expensive.
Yeah.
So lore that I've heard is that when both Caterpillar and John Deere first started thinking about autonomy in the 80s, the whole thing they were interested in were excavators. Because excavators are a relatively skilled job. It's super important for a lot of mining and quarry tasks. And yet here we are 45 odd years later. And while there are autonomous haul trucks, while there is autonomy in certain weird corners of the world of robotics, there's not a lot of autonomous digging.
Well, built.
Yeah,
right?
built. But built has gone from digging trenches to, at least according to an announcement of theirs 12 months ago, focusing on pile driving for solar farms.
Yeah. But I'm saying that was maybe a business case decision more than a tech decision.
But
who knows?
Why is it that people aren't digging in the dirt that much? Like as a kid, pretty early on, I was digging in dirt. Some would say I never stopped.
I think there's two problems. One is any of the stuff that you do digging, it's pretty hard to define exactly what you want. I guess the reason they want
I want a hole.
Yeah, I want a hole. Like how big? Where specifically? What do you do when you hit like a pipe? Or something, right?
Keep on digging.
Just keep digging. Yeah. And don't call before you dig, folks. Not necessary. And I think part of the reason Built went with trenches is that they're reasonably straightforward to define. Like, start here, go that direction for that distance.
Well, let's say we're talking about like digging in a mine where there's a work face, and that work face is essentially a cliff where they've blown up some stuff off of the side of it. Now there's like a mound of dirt on the ground next to it.
So that
like it seems to me like if you did a 3D scan of the space before you blew the stuff up, if you had some sort of file that said what they think the surface looks like underneath all the junk that fell off, then you have like, okay, cool, here's a pile of dirt. And now just do a little dig plan of like, first I'm going to take this scoop, then I'm going to take that scoop, then I'm going to take that scoop. Like why doesn't that exist? Why can't I buy that ideally at Kmart?
I think then you run into the second problem, which is materials are unpredictable when you try to move them around with a shovel. Like a perfectly dry pile of sand might be reasonably predictable, but any real material is going to have more or less moisture. It's going to clump more. It's going to clump less. And so you'd have to do this very relatively complex modeling of figuring out what the pile looks like. And then when you actually drive your implement into it, whatever shovel, right, you have to do some torque control where you're trying to push enough to pick up the dirt, but not so much that you go right through it and get stuck.
But could you put positioning sensors on your excavator scoop or your bucket to know when you're making poor progress, and then, you know, start tilting it back or doing the handful of things that people do when that happens?
You can, but you honestly do still want a little bit of torque feedback, probably as a robot, because the cheat you're doing here. So if you're a human driving an excavator, you're not going to feel necessarily how hard the machine is working. But a lot of operators, if you talk to them, they'll hear how hard the machine is working. They'll hear the compressor spin up or the hydraulics whine, and they'll know that their thing is stuck.
Let's talk about this, because I'm sure we talked about this on the show before, but why are hydraulics a hard thing as well?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a subcomponent of this problem.
Yeah, so a lot of this machinery uses hydraulics, and that makes sense because you could have one power plant that's whole job is to produce pressurized fluid. And then that fluid can be routed
by power plant, to be clear, you're talking about something that creates pressure for a particular joint of the excavator arm to open or close.
Yeah, if you think of your child's model of an excavator, there's this big body at the back behind the cab, and that body is a big generator and a pressurizer, and then a much smaller engine to drive the thing around. Most of the effort is going towards the pressurization. So you're pressurizing fluid, and you're using fluid, A, because of some efficiency reasons in cooling, but B, because if you have a leak, it doesn't explode. It just leaks slightly. So pressure is sort of easy to predict in a closed known system. You have this very standard physics equations defining how pressure changes. And so if you
volume
have this,
times mass, right?
PV equals nRT. The standard. But the problem with that is that works if you have a really good understanding of what all your cylinders are doing at different times. And if you have some unknown weight or amount of material or some unknown resistance to your digging effort, then it's no longer a linear relationship between how much pressure you're putting in and how much motion you're getting out.
Is it a predictably nonlinear?
Sort of, not really. And so the way that this is usually solved is you try to put an encoder, a linear encoder along the hydraulic unit to figure out what position the hydraulic unit is in. And then you can do a control loop closure of, I'm trying to get to this position. I'm going to ramp up or down my pressure as necessary to get to this position and hold it.
So, you know, I've looked at these machines and we've talked about this problem, and I'm still finding it somewhat hard to picture in my head. So maybe a way to think about it is if we built a robotic arm the way that I thought robots would work when I was a kid. And there's a hydraulic piston in between my shoulder and my forearm, like roughly where my bicep is. And that piston is extending when I want to reach my arm out, or it's compressing when I want to pull it in. You're saying that the pressure within that hydraulic piston, it has a non-linear relationship and a non-predictable relationship with how my arm is extended. That gets even harder to predict if I'm holding something in my hand or not. Yeah,
so it's reasonably easy to predict if you know everything about your arm and you're not holding anything, so you have a constant weight and you can figure that out. The hard part, is when you're actually picking up something of unknown mass.
But if I knew everything about my arm when it's holding nothing, and I did it, and I did it 100,000 times, so then I could measure exactly how my arm worked, then couldn't I just solve for the variable if I'm holding this beverage can?
Right, but let's say you're trying to do digging. You're trying to dig into a face. Is it now more difficult to do because the ground is a little bit more wet? Or is it because there's a boulder there? Or is it because your hydraulic's a little aged and it's the stiction of the cylinder is higher than it used to be? All these conflating factors make doing actual control loop around that quite difficult to make it sane. And so again, the cheat is either you put linear encoders on your hydraulic pistons themselves.
To know exactly where they are.
To know where they are. Or you put angular encoders on the joints. Or instead of the encoders, you put IMUs. And you figure out their position in space, and you figure it out that way. Or, optical markers to figure out their position in space. All of these are tricks to figure out where your thing actually is, given this nonlinear pressure to position relationship.
So if you know exactly where the thing is, you could then basically measure how much force you're putting into it, where its location is, how that's changing over time, and then you might be able to predict like what it is that you're trying to jam this bucket through.
Yeah. All this earth moving machinery has always historically been built for humans to control, and so it's all open loop.
Yeah.
When a driver, even a modern system that's digitally drive by wire, when they're moving a joystick to move an arm, they're just saying open the valve more or open the valve less.
Yeah.
That's it.
But like, what if I built an excavator from the ground up to be electric, like no hydraulics at all? Wouldn't that then make this a substantially easier problem to solve?
You'd have a really tough time because the strength to weight ratio of motors versus hydraulics is very poor.
Sorry, what do you mean?
So the benefit of hydraulics is all the heavy components, the compressor, the generator, the impeller, all of those things are in the body of the excavator, and just the piston, the actual workpiece, is on the arm. So when you're building your arm, you only have to think about the weight of a piston. Whereas with an electric motor, you have to put the electric motor all the way on the joint. So which means the weight of the entire motor is now all the way up there that you're trying to move around.
Which then makes your whole arm heavier, which makes your whole thing less efficient. Right. You could run power to it. Like some of these excavators don't actually have to move that much.
Yeah, I mean, but the other thing you could do is put all the motors in the base and run it through chains or cables or whatever. All those have
I had some children's book where they had steam shovels that like literally had a steam engine in the back with cables.
Yeah.
I was very upset to learn that was no longer reality.
All of those are way less efficient. You're losing tons of efficiency on...
Are you saying like literal tons? Or are you saying what like order of magnitude of efficiency you're losing?
Half. There's a reason those steam shovels don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
They were really big machinery for relatively low power output. Like a modern excavator would outperform it by an order of magnitude.
Okay, so the way that excavators are made, it makes it really hard to control.
Yeah.
The fundamental physics of the efficiency of how they'd have to work to be electric means that like maybe as energy density keeps on improving, and maybe as we keep on getting better at building electric motors with broader electrification, maybe that would change. But like we're starting to talk about dozens of miracles.
Yeah, I wouldn't bet on it. I would bet if you really want to solve this problem, you still have your existing hydraulic systems and you put some mechanism to detect the position. Again, visual fiducials, IMUs, encoders, whatever. I don't recommend encoders. Talking about dirt. Encoders in real world conditions break constantly. Especially optical encoders. They're fragile.
But we know some folks are using like LiDARs to determine the position of their buckets.
Yeah, exactly. You can do that sort of thing. I would recommend that a lot more than actually trying to instrument. Taking apart a hydraulic cylinder to insert a linear potentiometer is really painful. It's just so much work. Don't recommend it. So if you can externally measure the position. So now you have position.
Okay.
And now you have some idea of force. But honestly, again, because this equipment is built to be open loop, you might not actually know how much pressure is any particular cylinder. A lot of them will have maybe overpressure emergency valves. So if you don't see that thing,
could you measure the internal pressure of something like this from some sensor mounted to the outside of the cylinder?
Maybe you could do that ultrasonically.
Yeah.
But probably a better bet would be you'd retrofit the thing to put pressure sensors in line with the hydraulic lines. And that's a relatively more straightforward retrofit. And that would give you some idea of the pressurization of the system. But still, you're kind of solving this problem where all of this adds up to you don't have a great idea of exactly how much force you're exerting at the tip of your excavator.
Yep.
And so when you're digging into a material, is it stuck because you just didn't put enough power?
Yep.
Or is it stuck because it's a boulder? And if you keep pushing, you're going to break the teeth off your excavator head.
I mean, you could put like radar or something on the bucket of your excavator.
Yeah.
To figure out how thick or not thick the dirt is and if there's a boulder or whatever.
There are some tricks. So if you look at these really large bucket wheel excavators that are used for coal mines, for example, they are so massive. And again, this is kind of a common theme in mining in that this machinery is big because the profit scales with how much material you can process per hour.
Yeah.
So the more material, the better. Which means breaking a tooth on one of these bucket wheels is a big deal because you could bring your process to a halt. Not necessarily because the tooth is so critical, but if the tooth ends up in the material you're shipping out, that tooth will smash every piece of equipment down line because it's made to be ultra hard. So all your crushers will break, your grinders will break, all of it will break. So losing a tooth is a big deal. And so they've instrumented these giant bucket wheel excavators with a bunch of really high power LiDAR and radar and all that stuff. They still break teeth. More rarely, but predicting the consistency and hardness of a material that you're exposing for the first time of a few million years, it's not an exact science yet.
I mean, is it something where you could do cool AI stuff?
Maybe. Yeah, probably.
What if you were just putting GPT dirt?
Yeah.
Dirt GPT.
I mean, yeah, that would be, it'd be really interesting to see if optically, especially like a non-invasive measurement method, if you could use some hyperspectral imaging or something like that to predict material hardness. What
about in Jurassic Park when they did the ground thumping ultrasonic thing to find out where the dinosaur bones were? What if you did like big thumping of the ground to figure out the consistency of the dirt?
The problem again is that these are continuous processes.
Yeah.
Like this bucket wheel.
You just have an AGV that goes around and thumps the ground and maps out dirt consistency while you have a different vehicle that shovels up the dirt.
Maybe if it made sense, monetarily, I mean, they would have done it by now.
Yeah, I mean that ground thumping thing that I remember from Jurassic Park, that is just ultrasonic, and that's not a special ultrasonic thing.
It's infrasound.
Infrasound?
It's the other direction. So it's you use a very loud, very slow waveform, and you wait for it to come back. So it's microphones and a loud sound, basically. Yeah. But yeah,
what type of range can you get on a sensor like that?
How loud of a sound can you make? If you make a nuclear weapon,
ask our editor, who constantly talks about how I need to be turned down.
If you think of nuclear weapons, part of the way that they're detected was through seismographs, right? Which are basically just microphones. So you part of the way they study earthquakes these days is that they have a bunch of microphones listening for earthquakes, and they can measure the reflections going through different continents.
In a lot of these mines, they do blow stuff up frequently. So if you actually had a grid of microphones in the mine, you might be able to start predicting ground density.
I bet there is reams of people who actually do this for a living who are laughing at us right now because it's probably exactly what they do. Like their whole job is basically this, is predicting where to dig so that you're not digging dirt. You're actually
but like predicting where to dig might be different than you need accuracy on a shovel by shovel basis of the consistency of the dirt.
Yeah, it's a resolution problem.
Yeah.
So the other problem with digging materials is that if you have a pile of some aggregate.
So there's a facility we're talking to right now where they have a substance that needs to be fed into a hopper every 5 to 10 minutes. The substance gets piled up and you need to shovel it up in a wheel loader and then drop it in the hopper.
Yeah, exactly. And so even if you have a relatively predictable aggregate, if you imagine a pile of it, if I come in and scoop out a chunk of it, that first scoop might be relatively predictable. The second scoop might be relatively predictable, but eventually you're going to dig enough of a canyon that the sides are going to collapse in. And so your third scoop, if you did this kind of dumb system of scoop a meter ahead every time, or half a meter or whatever, you're going to end up in the wrong spot because the sides have collapsed in and the material's closer to you than it was before. So you would probably need to do some sort of loop closure of imaging your pile and predicting where the best place to scoop is.
But I mean, you might be able to get 5 or 6 autonomous scoops just by saying, I'm going to do a half meter or half bucket lateral offset to the left. Then I'm going to do a half bucket lateral offset to the right. Then we're going to do 3 forward in each of those. And then you just had 6 autonomous scoops.
And this is one of those solutions that will work well when the temperature and humidity and sunlight and the retrograde phase of Jupiter is exactly the right way.
Jupiter has a lot of impact on scooping.
And any other day you try this, it will fail miserably. Trying to open loop control piles of material is hard.
It shouldn't be. We're talking about a pile of grains that should be fairly predictable with how they tumble.
Yeah, I wish. Even.
But why aren't they? This seems like pretty straightforward physics.
I think this is one of those.
If we know how stars form, and how they and the life cycles of stars, I feel like we should know how piles of sand evolve as you take stuff out of their base.
This is one of those
Doesn't seem like one of the big hard questions in the world.
Easy to predict in small scale, impossible to predict in large scales across conditions. You're really running into the like fundamentally probabilistic nature of our reality, right? Like as you dig into it, the material is going to clump up a little more because this segment got wet when it was first mined, and this segment didn't.
That sounds almost a little bit less like we live in a simulation, which, you know.
Oh no, it's still well within. Just add some random parameters. Like you're basically saying, if I randomized a data set and you picked at that data set, why aren't you getting consistent results? It's like, well, yeah, because I fed you random data to start with. What do you expect?
So in other words, digging dirt's really, really easy. Robots can do it all the time.
Well, there's a third problem we haven't even talked about.
Oh, shoot. You said there's only two.
There's two to do with manipulation.
Okay.
The third problem to do with dirt in general is that it gets everywhere. Dust gets everywhere. And so all of your optical sensors get coated in dust and can't work as well. Dust gets into your encoders and stops them from working well. Gets into all your electronics. So all your electronics have to be basically waterproof to not immediately get coated with potentially conductive dust. And so
especially if you're in like a copper mine.
Well, I mean, even coal.
Coal's conductive?
Yeah, over short distances. Yeah. Huh. Yeah. It's carbon, right? Carbon is mildly conductive. I'm not talking across a meter. I'm talking like between two pins on an IC.
I was at a dinner, dear listeners. I was at a dinner on Tuesday night where I learned an interesting fact. So during a team event yesterday, I come to Ilia and said, "Hey, Ilia, I learned something neat yesterday. That the human hand has 29 degrees of freedom." And Ilia responded, "Duh."
No, I did not.
I was like, what? That's a really cool fact. I didn't know that fact. I studied this. Like, jeez.
That's
like, way to
news.
be uncharacteristically
fake news. No. What I was saying was I knew that the hand had way more degrees of freedom than you would imagine.
Yes,
because every finger.
You
has
weren't
like
surprised to learn it had more than two, but your response made it seem like everyone knows 29.
No, that's not what I meant. This is misquoting on the level of me saying that Stefan wants to build a favela in his backyard.
I have the space. I should be able to put a tiny house in my backyard and rent it out for $2,000 a month.
The slumlord dream. But no, coming back to it. So the level of whatever level of robustness you think you need for dust heavy, dirt heavy conditions.
And isn't there a rating system for this that you always love to call out?
Yeah. So there's a really good one. So everybody's kind of through cell phones and things have heard of the IP rating system for waterproofness. And people really usually stop at the IP68, which is waterproof submergible to 2 meters, I think, or 10 meters, some number for half an hour. The actual one you want to look for, which is much more difficult, is IP69K, which is not only submergible, but
you have to be able to submerge it in potassium.
No, you have to spray it with hot water from any angle. Because that's how they clean off this equipment.
Yep.
And so it's a high pressure heated hose.
Yep.
Right at your optical sensor. So hopefully it survives that.
I don't think Ouster makes them like that yet.
Well, yeah. So yeah, dust in general is rather challenging, especially heavy dust. And all your connectors have to be greased and locked and covered and weatherproofed, and all your equipment has to be dustproof and waterproof. It's a challenging environment.
So it's a hard condition to make anything work in. You then have to make a robot work in. Robots barely work. And then you got to figure out how to solve non-deterministic dirt problems.
Yeah.
So it's not so much like dirty deeds done too cheap. It's more like dirty deeds, maybe you can do them with all the money in the world.
And they'll work for a few months, and then something will burn out. Inevitably, something will get sprayed with mining slurry and immediately short out.
Yeah, not that big of a deal. We'll just have a humanoid go and wipe it off.
Yeah, that's right. Our knowledge AI system will get shipped out.
And with that, Ilia, what are we going to talk about next week?
Well, I think this week that we're recording, our previous episode's getting released.
Yeah.
So you're talking 2 weeks in the future.
Troublesome.
2 weeks in the future is beyond my
ability. I feel like we should push this episode out quickly because, this tweet that was meant for me is timely.
Well, all I know is 2 weeks is beyond my ability to predict. That is beyond my long-term planning time horizon.
Well, on that note, thank you all so much for joining us.
See you next time.